You don't have to know a man's name to disrespect him, but sometimes that mistake echoes for a lifetime. The low rumble of black government sedans rolled through the winding road leading to Arlington National Cemetery beneath a pale gray morning sky. American flags hung at half-staff, their slow movements carried by a cool October breeze that whispered through rows of white marble headstones stretching across the hills like silent guardians of history. Uniformed honor guards stood perfectly still near the entrance, every polished button catching the muted light as mourners in dark suits quietly gathered beyond the gates. The funeral of General Richard Hayes, a decorated four-star officer whose career had spanned more than 4 decades, was minutes away from beginning. Cabinet officials, retired commanders, senators, and military leaders arrived one convoy after another, each vehicle waved through after a quick inspection. Security had never been tighter. Then, without fanfare, an aging pickup truck eased into the visitor lane and came to a gentle stop several yards from the checkpoint. The driver stepped out slowly, closing the weathered door with deliberate care before reaching into the passenger seat for a modest bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. William Carter stood quietly beside the truck. At 87 years old, his back carried the natural bend of time, but his movements remained steady, never rushed. His charcoal suit had clearly seen many years, carefully pressed despite its faded fabric, and the polished black shoes beneath him bore tiny cracks earned through decades rather than neglect. Resting beneath his arm was a worn felt hat, whose brim had softened with age. There were no medals pinned across his chest, no colorful ribbons, no military insignia announcing who he had once been. To anyone passing by, he looked like another elderly man hoping to pay his respects. Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed him immediately. Young, disciplined, and proud of the authority that came with guarding one of the nation's most important ceremonies, Brooks stepped forward with measured confidence, extending one gloved hand before William could reach the gate. "Morning, sir. Invitation, please." William lifted his calm blue eyes toward the young soldier. They were clear despite the years, carrying a quiet stillness that somehow made the bustling checkpoint seem strangely louder. "I'm here for General Hayes," he answered softly. "He asked me to come." Brooks waited for the invitation that never appeared. His expression hardened just enough to become official rather than friendly. "I'm going to need your credentials, sir." William offered a faint, polite smile, but made no move toward his pockets. "I don't have any." A brief silence settled between them before Brooks shook his head. "Then I'm afraid you can't enter." Behind them, another motorcade approached, escorted by military police motorcycles whose flashing lights reflected against polished stone monuments. Families carrying folded programs moved respectfully through the open gates, while television crews quietly adjusted cameras from a distance. William remained exactly where he stood, holding the bouquet with both hands as though nothing around him could hurry the moment. Brooks glanced toward the growing line of arriving dignitaries, then back at the elderly stranger who simply refused to leave. "Sir," he said more firmly, "this is a restricted military funeral. Without authorization, I need you to step away from the entrance." William neither argued nor pleaded. His eyes drifted briefly toward the chapel beyond the trees where the first notes of a lone bugler were beginning to rise with the morning wind. His voice, when it came again, was almost lost beneath the distant music. "I made him a promise a very long time ago." Brooks frowned, hearing only the words, never imagining the weight they carried. William Carter did not move. The bouquet remained cradled gently in his weathered hands while the cool breeze carried the faint scent of autumn leaves across the cemetery entrance. Behind the checkpoint, another line of dark vehicles disappeared through the open gates, each passenger welcomed with quiet efficiency as military personnel offered respectful nods. The ceremony was drawing closer by the minute. Corporal Ethan Brooks shifted his weight, glancing toward the growing queue before returning his attention to the elderly stranger. Years of training had taught him that hesitation could create security risks, and every unfamiliar face had to be treated the same. To him, rules were not personal. They were absolute. "Sir," Brooks repeated, keeping his voice controlled, "if your name is on the guest list, I can verify it." "What is your full name?" William answered without the slightest trace of frustration. "William Carter." Brooks typed the name into the handheld security tablet hanging from his vest. His finger scrolled through the list once, then again, slower this time. Nothing appeared. He searched a second database reserved for military guests. Again, nothing. His expression became noticeably firmer. I am sorry, Mr. Carter. Your name is not authorized for today's ceremony. William simply nodded as though he had expected that answer long before arriving. That does not change why I came. Brooks exhaled quietly. The old man's calm refusal to argue somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable. Most people protested. Some became angry. Others demanded supervisors. William did none of those things. He merely stood with the same patient expression, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the distant chapel where the bugle had fallen silent. Nearby conversations gradually faded as several arriving guests noticed the exchange. Curious glances lingered before they continued through the entrance. An elderly couple slowed their pace for a moment before moving on. Two reporters exchanged puzzled looks while adjusting camera equipment. The checkpoint remained orderly, but an invisible tension had begun settling over the gate. At that moment, Lieutenant Mason Reed emerged from the security office carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. Freshly pressed dress blues fit him with perfect precision, every ribbon perfectly aligned across his chest. Barely 30 years old, Reed had earned a reputation for flawless organization and strict adherence to protocol. He approached with quick, confident strides, immediately sensing that something was delaying the flow of distinguished guests. What seems to be the issue, Corporal? Brooks straightened instantly. Sir, this gentleman claims he was invited personally, but he has no credentials, and his name does not appear in either registry. Reed's attention settled on William for several long seconds. His practiced eyes evaluated everything from the faded suit to the old pickup truck parked beyond the checkpoint. Nothing about the elderly visitor matched the carefully coordinated guest list he had reviewed for weeks. Good morning, sir. Reed began politely, though his tone carried unmistakable authority. Today is a restricted military event. Every attendee has been cleared in advance. Who exactly invited you? William met his gaze without hesitation. General Richard Hayes did. Reed paused only briefly before offering a restrained smile that carried more disbelief than kindness. General Hayes cannot confirm that today. Several nearby guards exchanged subtle glances. One quietly looked away to hide an uncomfortable smile, while another adjusted his gloves without speaking. William lowered his eyes briefly toward the bouquet of wildflowers, gently straightening a single stem that had shifted during the drive. His voice remained calm enough to blend almost completely into the whispering wind. No, he answered softly. He cannot. But he asked me many years ago, and I told him I would be here. Reed folded his arms across his chest, convinced he was dealing with nothing more than an elderly man clinging to a distant memory. Promises are meaningful, Mr. Carter, he replied evenly, but they do not replace security clearance. I need you to leave the entrance so the ceremony can proceed without interruption. William neither stepped backward nor forward. He simply stood where he was, holding the flowers with quiet dignity as the first church bell echoed faintly across the rolling hills, announcing that the funeral was about to begin. Lieutenant Mason Reed allowed the silence to linger for several seconds before taking one slow step closer. The polished leather of his shoes pressed firmly against the gravel, producing a sharp crunch that seemed unusually loud beneath the quiet sky. Around them, more guests had begun to notice the delay. Distinguished officers wearing rows of colorful service ribbons slowed their pace as they approached the checkpoint, exchanging brief glances before continuing toward the chapel. No one interrupted. Military funerals carried their own rhythm, and even curiosity respected the occasion. Reed maintained his professional posture, but impatience had begun to replace courtesy. Mr. Carter, he said, this ceremony is honoring one of the most respected officers our country has ever produced. Hundreds of people are expected today. Every guest standing beyond these gates followed the proper procedures. I need you to do the same. William looked toward the distant rows of white headstones shimmering beneath the pale morning light. The breeze gently stirred the brown paper around the bouquet, rustling the wildflowers as though nature itself refused to disturb the silence surrounding the cemetery. He finally answered without raising his voice. I have followed the only instruction that mattered. Reed frowned. And what instruction was that? William's eyes remained fixed beyond the gate. To be here. The simple reply drew another uneasy pause. Corporal Ethan Brooks shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing attention around them. A few mourners had quietly stopped several yards away, pretending to admire the landscape, while listening closely enough to understand pieces of the conversation. Reed noticed them as well. The checkpoint was becoming a distraction, something he had spent weeks ensuring would never happen. His tone became noticeably firmer. "Sir, you are creating an unnecessary situation. If someone truly wanted you here, arrangements would have been made." William lowered his gaze to the flowers once again. Not everyone believes promises need paperwork. Reed let out a slow breath through his nose. To him, the old man's words sounded less like confidence and more like confusion. He had encountered grieving relatives before, people who convinced themselves they deserved exceptions because of emotion. This appeared no different. "Mr. Carter," Reed said, "I understand today may be meaningful to you, but General Hayes served thousands of people during his lifetime. Many admired him. That does not grant unrestricted access." William nodded gently. "You are right." Reed seemed almost relieved to hear agreement until William quietly continued. "Admiration is not why I came." The words landed with unexpected weight, though no one present fully understood them. A faint church bell echoed again from deeper inside the cemetery, followed moments later by the distant sound of a military band beginning its opening hymn. The funeral had officially started. Reed glanced toward the chapel before making his decision. "Corporal Brooks," he said calmly, "escort Mr. Carter back to the visitor parking area. If he wishes to remain on cemetery grounds after the ceremony concludes, he may return during public visiting hours." Brooks hesitated only briefly before stepping toward William. "Sir," he said respectfully, "please come with me." William neither resisted nor argued. Instead, he slowly adjusted the bouquet beneath one arm before reaching into the inside pocket of his worn suit jacket. Brooks instinctively stiffened, though the elderly man moved with deliberate care. After a moment, William removed nothing more threatening than an old leather glasses case, faded by decades of use. He opened it carefully, searching for his reading glasses, but as the case tilted in his weathered hands, a small tarnished bronze pin slipped free and landed softly on the gravel between them. It was no larger than a silver dollar, uneven around the edges, its surface worn smooth by countless years. There was no official military crest, no recognizable emblem. It looked almost homemade, an insignificant piece of aged metal that could easily have been mistaken for scrap. Brooks barely noticed it, but Lieutenant Reed immediately looked down. He bent slightly, picked it up between two fingers, and turned it toward the morning light with a puzzled expression. "This?" he asked with a restrained chuckle. "Is this supposed to mean something?" William's calm expression changed for the first time since arriving. Not into anger, but into something far quieter and infinitely deeper. His pale blue eyes settled on the old bronze pin as though they were no longer seeing the gravel beneath Arlington's gates, but another place separated by countless miles and many forgotten years. Lieutenant Mason Reed rolled the tarnished bronze pin slowly between his fingers, studying its rough edges with open skepticism. There was no polished finish, no engraved eagle, no official seal, nothing that resembled any military decoration he had ever seen. It looked like an ordinary piece of weathered metal that someone had drilled a small hole through decades earlier. Reed let out a restrained laugh that was quiet enough to remain respectful of the funeral, yet unmistakably dismissive. "I have reviewed hundreds of military insignias," he said. "This is not one of them." A couple of nearby guards exchanged uncertain smiles while several mourners watched from a respectful distance, curious but unwilling to interfere. William Carter extended one hand slowly, not demanding the pin back, merely waiting. His face remained calm, but the peaceful stillness in his eyes had deepened into something almost impossible to describe. Reed noticed it, but misunderstood it completely. He assumed he was looking at sentimental attachment to an old keepsake. "Was this from your unit?" Reed asked. William answered after a brief pause. "No." "Then what is it?" Reed continued. William's fingers gently closed around the bouquet as the breeze lifted a few silver strands of his white hair. "A promise." Reed glanced again at the small piece of bronze before lightly turning it over. "That is a very unusual answer." Without thinking, he brushed his thumb across the worn surface, attempting to remove decades of tarnish as though a hidden symbol might appear beneath it. The instant his skin touched the smooth metal, William's quiet gaze drifted far beyond the cemetery gates. The crisp autumn air disappeared. The neat rows of marble faded into another landscape carried only in memory. He no longer heard distant church bells or the gentle murmur of arriving guests. Instead, he remembered the steady rhythm of helicopter blades echoing across a humid valley many decades earlier. The air had been thick with mist before sunrise, and every uniform had been soaked by endless rain that clung to everything it touched. A much younger Richard Hayes had been standing beside him then, not wearing stars on his shoulders, but the plain insignia of a young captain still learning the weight of command. His face had been streaked with exhaustion, yet his eyes had carried absolute determination. They had been surrounded by uncertainty, by broken equipment, impossible choices, and responsibilities far greater than their years. As dawn finally broke through the low clouds, Richard had reached into the pocket of his field jacket and pulled out a jagged fragment of bronze from damaged aircraft equipment that would never fly again. It was an ordinary piece of metal to everyone else. To him, it represented survival, loyalty, and the people who had refused to leave one another behind. Sitting on an overturned supply crate, Richard had used nothing more than a small hand file borrowed from a mechanic to smooth its sharp edges. The work had taken nearly an hour. When he finished, he drilled a tiny opening through one side and threaded a simple cord through it before placing it into William's hand. "The government can give medals," Richard had said with a tired smile, "but this belongs only to us." William had looked down at the rough piece of bronze with quiet confusion. "It is not worth much." Richard had shaken his head. "It reminds me who kept their promise when everything else fell apart." The memory lingered for only a heartbeat before dissolving like morning fog. William found himself standing once again at the cemetery entrance while Lieutenant Reed still held the pen between his fingers, completely unaware of the history resting in his hand. "It really is just an old piece of metal," Reed said, preparing to hand it back. "I am afraid it does not help your situation." William accepted the pen carefully, almost reverently, placing it back inside the leather glasses case before closing it with gentle precision. His voice remained steady, carrying neither disappointment nor resentment. "It was never meant to help me." Reed looked puzzled. "Then why keep it after all these years?" William raised his eyes toward the chapel hidden beyond the trees where the funeral hymn floated softly across the rolling hills. "Because one day," he answered quietly, "I knew I would need it to remember the last promise I ever made to my best friend." William's words settled into the cool morning air with a quiet weight that none of the people surrounding him could fully understand. Lieutenant Mason Reed gave a polite nod that carried more impatience than sympathy. To him, the elderly visitor was simply another man whose memories had become larger than reality. He checked the time on his wristwatch before looking toward the chapel again. The opening prayers had already begun. Every additional minute spent at the entrance pulled security personnel away from their assignments. "Mr. Carter," Reed said carefully, "I respect that your friendship meant something to you, but I cannot delay an official military ceremony because of a personal story." William did not respond immediately. His eyes rested on the distant American flag above the chapel, its slow movement matching the steady rhythm of the autumn wind. After several seconds, he quietly replied, "You are not delaying the ceremony because of my story. You are delaying it because you have not yet learned whose story it really is." Reed frowned, uncertain whether the old man was speaking in riddles or simply refusing to accept reality. Before he could answer, another group of senior officers entered through the gate, offering brief acknowledgments to the security team as they passed. One of them, Captain Daniel Cooper, walked several steps behind the others while reviewing a printed schedule. Known throughout the installation for noticing details that others overlooked, Cooper rarely hurried, even on important occasions. As he approached the checkpoint, the unusual gathering near the entrance immediately caught his attention. He did not interrupt. Instead, he quietly observed from several yards away while the other officers continued toward the chapel. Brooks noticed him first and offered a quick salute. Cooper returned it with a slight nod, but kept his attention on William. There was nothing remarkable about the elderly man's appearance. His suit was modest. His pickup truck was old. His bouquet consisted of simple wildflowers instead of the expensive floral arrangements arriving every few minutes. Yet something about the way he stood felt strangely familiar. Not his face, not his voice, His posture, calm without being passive, patient without appearing uncertain. Cooper had seen that kind of composure only a handful of times during his career, usually in people who no longer felt any need to prove themselves. Reed finally turned toward the captain. "Everything is under control," he said confidently. "Just a visitor without authorization." Cooper gave a small nod before his eyes drifted naturally toward William's hands. The leather glasses case had not been fully closed. As William adjusted his grip on the bouquet, the tarnished bronze pin briefly became visible again beneath the morning light. Cooper's expression changed almost imperceptibly. He took one slow step closer, narrowing his eyes. The object itself was ordinary. There was no official marking to recognize. Yet something deep inside his memory stirred. Months earlier, during a planning meeting inside General Richard Hayes's office, Cooper remembered waiting while the general finished a phone call. His attention had wandered across the room until it settled on a shadow box displayed beside the bookshelf. Unlike the polished metals surrounding it, one small bronze object had stood alone without a nameplate or explanation. Curious, Cooper had once asked whether it was an old unit insignia. General Hayes had smiled quietly before answering, "No, that belongs to someone far more important than any medal hanging on this wall." At the time, Cooper had thought little of the remark. Now, standing at the cemetery entrance, he stared at the worn bronze pin resting inside William Carter's glasses case. The shape was almost identical. The same uneven edges. The same weathered surface. Even the tiny hole drilled through one corner appeared to match the object he had seen inside the general's private office. Cooper's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from growing uncertainty. He looked from the pin to William, then toward the chapel where the funeral continued, before reaching slowly for the secure radio clipped beneath his jacket. For the first time that morning, he began to wonder whether everyone at the entrance had misunderstood the man standing quietly before them. Captain Daniel Cooper did not press the transmit button immediately. Years in uniform had taught him that instinct alone was never enough. Yet instinct had saved careers, missions, and lives more than once. He looked again at William Carter, searching the elderly man's face for recognition, but nothing came. It was the bronze pin that refused to leave his thoughts. He remembered standing in General Richard Hayes's office only 6 months earlier while discussing preparations for an upcoming Veterans Outreach event. The general had noticed Cooper studying the display case and had walked over without saying a word. Instead of pointing toward the rows of medals, campaign ribbons, or photographs with presidents and Allied commanders, Hayes had rested one hand on the small bronze pin. His expression had changed in a way Cooper had never forgotten. There had been pride, certainly, but also gratitude so deep that it almost looked like humility. "Every promotion I ever received hangs somewhere in this room," Hayes had said quietly. "But if this little piece of bronze ever disappears, I will notice before I notice any of the others." Cooper had smiled politely, assuming there must be an interesting story behind it. "Was it awarded to you, sir?" Hayes had shaken his head. "No. It was entrusted to me." Before Cooper could ask another question, the general had added one final sentence that seemed strangely mysterious at the time. "If you ever meet the man who carries its twin, do not keep him waiting." The memory returned with startling clarity as Cooper stared at the nearly identical pin inside William Carter's worn leather case. His pulse quickened. Coincidence suddenly felt impossible. He stepped away from the gathering without drawing attention, walking toward the security office beside the entrance where radio traffic remained quiet. Lieutenant Mason Reed noticed him leaving but assumed the captain had simply returned to his assigned duties. Brooks remained beside William, maintaining professional courtesy while watching the growing number of guests disappear through the cemetery gates. Cooper finally lifted the secure radio. His voice stayed calm and measured. "Operations, this is Captain Daniel Cooper. I need immediate confirmation on a historical item connected to General Hayes." A brief pause followed before the dispatcher answered. "Go ahead, Captain." Cooper chose every word carefully. "Is there any standing instruction concerning a civilian named William Carter?" Silence filled the channel for several long seconds. Papers shuffled faintly somewhere inside the operations center before another voice joined the conversation, older and noticeably more cautious. "Repeat the name." "William Carter," Cooper answered. 87 years old. Waiting at the main entrance. This time the silence lasted longer. Cooper could almost imagine someone searching archived files that few people ever opened. Finally, the older voice returned, sounding very different than before. "Captain, remain on the line." Cooper waited as a distant telephone rang through the open radio microphone. Another voice answered. Muffled conversation followed, too faint to understand. Then the line suddenly became clear again. "Captain Cooper, do not allow Mr. Carter to leave the entrance." Cooper straightened instinctively. "Understood. Is there a problem?" The answer came without hesitation. "There is no problem, Captain. There may be a very significant mistake. Stay with him. We are notifying the General's executive aide immediately." Cooper lowered the radio slowly, feeling the full weight of those words settle across the quiet morning. He turned toward the cemetery gate, where William still stood exactly where he had been all along, holding the bouquet of wildflowers with patient dignity, while Lieutenant Reed continued believing he was simply waiting for an elderly stranger to accept disappointment. Neither Reed nor Brooks noticed the change in Cooper's expression as he walked back toward them. But Cooper now understood one thing with complete certainty. The man standing outside the gate was no ordinary visitor, and somewhere inside the funeral ceremony, news was already beginning to move faster than anyone at the entrance could possibly imagine. Inside the chapel, the quiet notes of the military hymn drifted beneath the vaulted ceiling as hundreds of mourners remained standing in respectful silence. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting soft bands of light across polished wooden pews and neatly pressed uniforms. At the front of the sanctuary rested the flag-draped casket of General Richard Hayes, surrounded by carefully arranged wreaths sent from military commands across the nation. Every detail reflected decades of distinguished service. Near the front row, Colonel Stephen Marshall, serving as the ceremony coordinator, leaned toward the General's longtime executive aide, Margaret Ellis, whispering that the opening tributes were ready to begin. Before she could answer, the secure phone clipped beneath her jacket vibrated sharply. She stepped quietly into the side aisle and answered in a hushed voice. Margaret Ellis speaking. The operations officer on the other end wasted no time. "Ma'am, Captain Daniel Cooper has reported that a civilian named William Carter is waiting outside the main entrance." Margaret froze. The name seemed to drain every trace of color from her face. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. The officer continued carefully. "Ma'am, are you familiar with the name?" Margaret slowly closed her eyes. "Very familiar." Her answer came almost as a whisper. Years earlier, while organizing General Hayes's retirement archives, she had discovered a sealed envelope marked in the General's unmistakable handwriting. It contained only a single instruction. "If William Carter ever arrives, no matter the occasion, no matter the schedule, bring him to me immediately." She had once asked General Hayes why such an unusual instruction mattered so much. The general had looked out the window of his office for nearly a full minute before answering. "Some people shaped your life long before anyone ever noticed your career." Margaret opened her eyes and spoke into the phone with sudden urgency. "Is Mr. Carter still outside?" "Yes, ma'am." "Has anyone informed Lieutenant Reed who he is?" "Negative." She inhaled deeply. "Do not let him leave under any circumstances." Colonel Marshall noticed the concern on her face as she lowered the phone. "Margaret, what happened?" She turned toward him with unmistakable urgency. "General Hayes left permanent standing instructions regarding one specific visitor." Marshall frowned. "Who?" "William Carter." The colonel searched his memory, but came up empty. "I have never heard that name." Margaret nodded slowly. "Almost no one has." Without another word, she crossed the aisle toward the senior protocol officer overseeing the ceremony. The timing could not have been worse. A distinguished speaker had just approached the podium to begin the first official remembrance. Interrupting now would break every carefully planned sequence. Yet Margaret knew the general's wishes more clearly than anyone else alive. She leaned close enough to avoid disturbing the audience. "We have to pause." The protocol officer stared at her in disbelief. "Pause. We are already underway." Margaret's voice remained steady despite the urgency behind it. General Hayes anticipated this possibility years ago. "What possibility?" he asked quietly. She answered with complete certainty. "That William Carter might arrive late." The officer looked toward the casket, then back at Margaret. "Are you telling me the general planned for this?" "He did not simply plan for it," she replied. "He insisted upon it." A long silence followed before the officer reached for his own secure radio. Outside, the autumn breeze continued carrying fallen leaves across the cemetery entrance, while William Carter stood exactly where he had stood since arriving, his bouquet resting gently in his hands. Lieutenant Mason Reed remained convinced he was enforcing proper procedure, unaware that inside the chapel, a chain of conversations was spreading from one senior official to another with increasing speed. One by one, experienced officers who had served beside Richard Hayes for decades began hearing the same name, and with every repetition the atmosphere inside the funeral quietly shifted from solemn ceremony to growing astonishment. Outside the cemetery gates, nothing appeared to have changed. The autumn wind continued to sweep quietly across the rolling hills, carrying a handful of amber leaves between the rows of white marble headstones. William Carter remained exactly where he had stood since arriving, holding the bouquet of wildflowers with both hands as though time itself had slowed around him. His calm expression never wavered. Lieutenant Mason Reed, however, noticed something unusual. One after another, secure radios clipped to the uniforms of nearby officers began crackling with short, urgent transmissions. None lasted more than a few seconds, yet each conversation ended the same way. The officer receiving the message looked toward William before immediately contacting someone else. Reed frowned. That was not normal. Captain Daniel Cooper stepped quietly beside him. "Lieutenant," he said evenly, "do not ask Mr. Carter to leave." Reed looked surprised. "Captain, we already established that he is not on the guest list." Cooper kept his eyes on William. "I know. Then why are we changing procedure?" Before Cooper could answer, another staff vehicle approached the checkpoint much faster than the previous arrivals. It stopped several yards away, and Margaret Ellis stepped out before the driver had fully opened her door. Even after years of serving as General Hayes's executive aide, she had never once hurried in public. Today she crossed the gravel with unmistakable purpose. Reed immediately straightened. "Ma'am." She acknowledged him with a brief nod before walking directly toward William. The moment she stopped in front of him, her professional composure softened. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "I have been hoping I would recognize you if this day ever came." William offered the same gentle smile he had carried all morning. "Margaret, it has been a long time." Reed stared at both of them, unable to hide his confusion. "You know each other?" Margaret turned toward him, her expression neither angry nor accusatory, only deeply disappointed by the situation that had unfolded. "General Hayes instructed me many years ago that if Mr. Carter ever arrived, regardless of the occasion, he was to be brought directly to him." Reed felt the color leave his face. "Ma'am, General Hayes." He stopped, realizing the obvious impossibility of finishing the sentence. Margaret nodded slowly. Those instructions remained permanent. They were never removed. Before anyone could speak again, another secure radio sounded. Captain Cooper answered immediately. "Cooper." The response came through clearly enough that Brooks, Reed, and Margaret could hear portions of it. "The ceremony has been paused. Senior Command requests confirmation. Is William Carter still at the entrance?" Cooper answered without hesitation. "He is standing with us now. Do not move him. Escort will arrive in less than 2 minutes." Reed blinked in disbelief. The ceremony had been paused. An official military funeral honoring one of the nation's most respected officers had been interrupted because of the elderly man he had tried to turn away. Around the checkpoint, the atmosphere changed almost instantly. Guards who had been watching from a distance quietly straightened their posture. Conversations faded. Even arriving guests sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding, though none of them yet understood why. William himself showed no sign of satisfaction. He did not look vindicated. He did not remind anyone of what he had said earlier. Instead, he gently adjusted the wrapping around the bouquet to keep one of the wildflowers from slipping free. Brooks watched him with growing respect. "Sir," he asked softly, "why did you never tell us who you really were?" William looked toward the chapel where the funeral waited in respectful silence. His answer came as calmly as every other word he had spoken that morning. "Because if a promise needs an introduction before people believe it, then they are listening to the name instead of the person." In the distance, the sound of approaching engines echoed across the cemetery roads. Every uniformed head at the entrance slowly turned toward the same direction as a black command vehicle emerged between the rows of trees, moving steadily toward the gate while an unmistakable stillness settled over everyone waiting there. The black command vehicle came to a smooth stop just inside the cemetery entrance, its engine falling silent beneath the whisper of the autumn wind. Every conversation faded. Every movement seemed to pause. Uniformed officers instinctively straightened their posture as the rear door opened and a tall four-star general stepped onto the gravel. General Thomas Whitaker, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had been seated in the front row of the funeral only moments earlier. Without acknowledging the waiting dignitaries or the officers gathered around him, he walked with steady purpose toward William Carter. Lieutenant Mason Reed felt his pulse quicken. He had expected questions. He had expected clarification. He had not expected the highest-ranking officer present to leave the ceremony entirely. William remained exactly where he stood, holding the bouquet of wildflowers as calmly as he had since arriving. The two men stopped only a few feet apart. For several long seconds, neither spoke. General Whitaker simply looked into William's eyes, as though recognizing someone he had known through stories long before meeting him in person. Then, without hesitation, the general came to full attention and rendered a perfect military salute. The crisp movement echoed louder than any speech could have. Across the entrance, every soldier present instinctively followed. Corporal Ethan Brooks raised his hand. Captain Daniel Cooper did the same. One after another, every uniformed service member standing near the gate stood at attention in complete silence. William looked gently at the general before returning the salute with slow, practiced dignity. When both men lowered their hands, General Whitaker spoke quietly enough that those nearest had to lean slightly closer to hear him. Mr. Carter, General Hayes asked all of us to remember one thing if this day ever came. He told us that if you arrived after he was gone, the ceremony was not truly complete until you stood beside him one final time. William lowered his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath before looking toward the chapel. Richard always worried I would be late, he said with the faintest smile. A few people nearby smiled through quiet emotion. Whitaker's expression softened. He also left one final written instruction. Margaret Ellis carefully removed a folded envelope from her portfolio and handed it to the general. The seal had remained untouched for years. Whitaker opened it with deliberate care before reading aloud. If my friend William Carter is standing outside while honors are being given to me, then every honor being shown has missed its purpose. Bring him in first. He carried responsibilities no metal could measure, and I spent the rest of my life trying to deserve the friendship he gave so freely. Silence settled over the cemetery with a weight greater than any applause. Lieutenant Reed lowered his eyes, unable to hide his regret. He stepped forward slowly until he stood before William. Mr. Carter, he said sincerely, I judged you by what I could see. I should have listened before I decided. I am deeply sorry. William placed one gentle hand on the young officer's shoulder. Every soldier spends a lifetime learning, he replied. Today was simply one more lesson. Together, they began walking toward the chapel. There was no rush. Honor guards quietly opened the path. Mourners stepped aside without being asked. As William reached the flag-draped casket, he laid the simple bouquet of wildflowers beside it and rested the small bronze pin gently on top for just a moment before placing it back into his pocket. He stood in silence, offering no speech because none was needed. Every person present understood that they were witnessing not the recognition of a forgotten hero, but the fulfillment of a promise that had survived the passing of decades. Outside, the American flag continued to move gently beneath the brightening sky, and the quiet truth remained with everyone who had witnessed that morning. Respect is never measured by appearance. It is revealed by character, remembered through loyalty, and carried forward by those who choose to honor their promises long after the world has forgotten them.